Joining me now, we have Vera Bergen-Gruen, Wall Street Journal national security reporter, and David Deptula, retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General, now Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Welcome to you both. Vera, you've been writing about the shifting timelines on the war, with Secretary Rubio telling G7 counterparts in private the war should conclude in a matter of weeks, not months. And today, the Washington Post reports the Pentagon is preparing several options for the president, including weeks of ground operations. Did G7 allies believe Rubio's 2 to 4 week projection?
It's a good question. I mean, at the same, as you mentioned, at the same time that Rubio was telling them this, we're seeing these Marines arrive. We're hearing that 10,000 extra ground troops are being considered. And, you know, the other important thing is that Rubio was telling them, we actually don't need these ground troops to meet our military objectives. So, you know, he's giving them a very particular timeline, obviously in his role as America's top diplomat to an extent. And at the same time, you know, it really is highlighting this approach that Trump has taken, which is to both negotiate and escalate at the same time, or at least to indicate he's open to negotiating. So, you know, again, I think one of the signals is meant to be to allies. The other one is meant to go to Iran. And we don't really know which way it's going to go. Rubio is basically saying, of course, we're sending all of these troops. We just want the president to have these options. But as you know, if they're in position, you know, it does seem more likely that they're going to be used, if history's any guide here.
But Vera, what does it say on the heels of Inzamam and his reporting there from Dubai that the Gulf states don't want this to just end in a ceasefire? They want regime change. We've seen the president decapitate leadership in day one, and yet we're still here fighting.
You know, you've stopped hearing U.S. officials speak as much about regime change now. So, you know, as you mentioned, I mean, that was Trump's initial video. That was one of the main takeaways. Now, you know, they're really, really distracted and focused much more on the economic fallout. So, you know, most of these negotiations that we're discussing aren't really even talking about some of the military objectives or about regime change. They're only discussing, you know, containing the economic fallout, reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So, again, it's been these multiplying reasons and goals and end games that they're putting out there. And regime change, you know, does seem to have gone to the bottom of the list for now.
General, as 3,500 of 8,000 expected U.S. Marines and sailors arrived in the Middle East, the Wall Street Journal is reporting the Pentagon is considering sending an additional 10,000. MS Now's David Road reports on the risks of using ground troops for missions like taking control of Kharg Island or parts of the Iranian coastline along the Strait of Hormuz. Is a potential 18,000 troop buildup meant to intimidate Iran into a deal?
Well, Alex, it's an interesting question. Let me start at a macro level for the audience. The U.S. military doctrine embraces a concept known as joint warfighting, and in a nutshell, that means using the right force at the right place at the right time to achieve a campaign's declared objectives. So it's not unusual to see Central Command contingency planning involve ground forces. Particularly if diplomacy stalls and maritime pressure in the Gulf persists. Now, use of ground forces is not necessarily a preferred option because of the risk of great casualties. However, there may be an option if there are objectives that cannot be accomplished any other way. A perfect example is physically securing Iran's enriched uranium. So the idea of, are we going to use them? Or are we not going to use them? Frankly, that is going to depend upon the equation in terms of what is their intended purpose to achieve what particular outcome or effect. And there are many different ways to achieve the effect of negating Kharg Island as an element of Iran's influence other than the introduction of ground forces. But I just offer that, you know, this is not an on-off switch. It's about what's the appropriate use of force to achieve the desired outcome or objectives of the campaign.
So, General, the Post quotes officials saying that any potential ground operation would fall short of a full-scale invasion and could instead involve raids by special operations forces and conventional infantry troops. But, sir, is there any guarantee of this? What would prevent mission creep that could lead to some sort of invasion or occupation?
Well, it's an excellent question, and there is no guarantee. There are no guarantees in war because the level of uncertainty, and then on the side of those who are initiating the operations, in this case, the United States and Israel, what are the specific desired outcomes? So there are no guarantees, and clearly we have seen and we've witnessed examples of intent turning into mission creep. The most flagrant example, quite frankly, was in Afghanistan, when in fact the United States had accomplished its desired strategic outcomes by the 31st of December in 2001, but we spent the next 20 years trying to change a collection of 16th century tribes into a modern Jeffersonian democracy. So things happen. There are no guarantees.
Secretary Rubio, Vera, also said that the U.S. can meet its objectives in Iran without any ground troops, adding that U.S. objectives remain the same. But was he clear on what those objectives are?
Again, depending on the audience, in this case, speaking to his counterparts there in France, he defined them quite narrowly again. And you've seen Rubio and some others kind of narrow the scope in terms of, taking out certain, some of Iran's capabilities, kind of outlining very narrow military objectives and saying, these are the things we're actually trying to accomplish, and then we're gone. But again, as we've discussed, the reason that some of those troops are there and the reason that they're coming up with all these other plans is because of this broader regional war that has been unleashed by the decision to attack in the first place. So now, they're discussing, part of his meeting with these European allies was to discuss the post-fighting plan. How are we going to make sure that the shipping lanes stay open, that Iran doesn't really control them? So, it's really it's ballooned the number of things they have to discuss. And, at the same time, whenever he speaks publicly, he keeps insisting that there's these very narrow goals. And once those are accomplished, the United States can go home.
Really quickly, Vera, is it clear that the United States and Iran are in negotiations?
As we noted, not in direct conversations. They keep indicating, both sides, that they're open. We saw this flurry back and forth earlier this week from a U.S. proposal, which was basically like a maximalist wish list of all the things they wanted. Iran says that's unacceptable. They sent theirs back. So as of now, at least, it doesn't really look like, it looks like they're talking past each other, but they're both still indicating they want to talk.
Okay. Lieutenant General David Deptula and Vera Bergen-Gruen, thank you both so much.